Let me now turn to part 2, language as a window into emotion. And again, I'll begin with a puzzle of language. 4 years ago, the Golden Globe Awards were broadcast on live network television on NBC, and accepting an award on behalf of the rock group U2, its leader, Bono, said in accepting the award, "This is really, really fucking brilliant." Now, the switchboards lit up like a Christmas tree. The case eventually landed up on the desk of the FCC, which had to decide whether to fine the network for failing to bleep out the offending word. And somewhat surprisingly, the FCC chose not to fine NBC, saying that their regulations defined indecency as, quote, material that describes or depicts sexual or excretory organs or activities, and that the fucking and fucking brilliant is, quote, an adjective or expletive to emphasize an exclamation. Well, cultural conservatives were enraged, and there were a number of bills filed in Congress to close that loophole, of which my favorite is House Resolution 3687, the Clean Airwaves Act, which I will now read in its entirety. You can look it up. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled that Section 1464 of Title 18 United States Code is amended, 1, by inserting a before whoever, and 2, the term profane used with respect to language includes the words shit, piss, fuck, cunt, asshole, and the phrases cocksucker, motherfucker, and asshole. Compound use, including hyphenated compounds of such words and phrases with each other or with other words or phrases, and other grammatical forms of such words and phrases, including verb, adjective, gerund, participle, and infinitive forms. Unfortunately, the fucking and fucking brilliant is an adverb, and that's the one part of speech that he forgot to include on the list. So, grammar matters. Linguistics is important. Militant religions, like other militant ideologies, that denigrate the value of the life of an individual man, woman, or child, I think are among the most pernicious destructive forces. And the general secularization of the world since the time of the Enlightenment, I believe, is one of the forces that has help reduce violence in many parts of the world. Institutionalized forms of violence like the Inquisition, the Crusades, the wars of religion, that some of the remaining threats do come from religious ideologies that still glorify the creed, the faith, the religion over the lives on earth of individual men, women, and children.
Yes, most people have the stereotype that science is about inventing gadgets, curing diseases, monitoring the environment, a narrow utilitarian focus on the material world, on stuff and bodies. But science is much broader than that. It's really our best attempt to understand the world around us, including the world of other people, including the world of politics and history and economics. I see science as, first of all, being committed to the idea that the world is intelligible, that there are explanations behind phenomena, and also that the search for those explanations is hard, that we are, the human brain by itself is ill-equipped to figure out how the world works. Our brains evolved to solve concrete problems like finding out which plants are safe to eat or how best to trap an animal. They're not so good left to their own devices at figuring out not only how the material world works, where life came from, but why wars start and stop, what drives the crime rate up and down, what's good or bad for the economy or the environment or education. But that science can be applied to these problems, and often it delivers surprises. That when you explicitly acknowledge that our own common sense is likely to be a source of error, that there are enough psychologists have characterized a number of bugs in our cognitive software, by devising workarounds for those bugs, which is what I see science as being the business of doing, you can often be surprised at the state of the world and surprised at what we can do to move the state of the world in directions that we like.
An alternative way of thinking about it is that sentience is something that is an aspect of having a highly articulated set of internal representations that evolved for an evolutionary purpose. Why it has this extra aspect of subjectivity is just something that our mind can't grasp, simply because the mind itself is a product of natural selection. And just as some of these questions about morality make your brain hurt at a certain point, and you run out of the resources with which to think of alternatives or to take a high enough bird's eye view in which to say something sensible about why it's that way as opposed to some other way, my own gut feeling is that the question of why sentience exists might be like that.
Right.
There's a funny sense in which we have a complete understanding of sentience, and there's no mystery, namely anything you could say about it, except for the fact that it exists, anything you can say about it is perfectly amenable to causal explanation.
Right.
Why does sugar taste sweet, and why is sweet pleasurable? Well, I can give you a perfectly sensible evolutionary explanation of that, for everything except the fact that there is this someone who's experiencing it. But if I say, what is it that you're experiencing? And you say, well, I want more of it, it puts a smile on my face, and so on. Everything you say about it, I can explain in old-fashioned evolutionary terms. So there is something maddening about it in that it's, in the one sense, completely comprehensible, and in the other sense, bafflingly incomprehensible. And what that makes me think is that we've run into some limitation in our own mind, akin to the one that makes it very difficult or impossible for us to understand that time came into existence with the Big Bang.
Right.
Well, what do you mean time started then? Well, what was it like before that? No. You're not supposed to think before that. There was no before that. Forget your ordinary way of thinking about things in terms of before and after. And my sense is that the puzzle of first-person subjective experience is a bit like that. It's a point at which we keep, it's a circle that we fall into that makes me think that there's a rule of the thinking game that is making us a victim of this, but that ultimately we may not need any notion of purpose or some other intelligence that gave it to us. It may fall out of it for reasons that our mind can't quite grasp. One view is that there is actually a discipline devoted to topics that the human mind is incapable of understanding, and that discipline is called philosophy.
Right.
And most philosophers hate that characterization, but it was one of them, Colin McGinn, who suggested that philosophy is the subject, is the study of problems that the human mind is incapable of understanding.
Yeah.
But it has a natural affinity to religion, and McGinn points out that virtually every problem in philosophy has had a religious explanation historically. Free will, consciousness, morality, knowledge.
And often the specific religious explanations get debunked or are no longer tenable in light of science, and yet the problem itself remains unsolved.
There's often some nugget, some kernel that remains unsolved. Yeah.
That's interesting.
My guest today on the Science Studio is Steven Pinker, who's the Johnston Family Professor at Harvard University, who was at MIT before that. He's a well-known cognitive scientist who works in language, and he's perhaps best known for a trilogy of books. The first one, The Language Instinct, second, How the Mind Works, and the third one, which is the reason he's here today, is The Stuff of Thought. Steve, welcome.
Thank you.
To what extent, in dealing with these sorts of issues, does having come from a Jewish background colour the way you think?
Well, I think I didn't have my religious background was mostly cultural, not theological. I don't think the word God was ever mentioned in my household. I went to Sunday school, and there wasn't a whole lot of God talk there. It was there was a lot of arguing, and Jews are famous for being opinionated. There's the old expression, 10 Jews, 11 opinions. Right. And so that tradition perhaps handed down from Talmudic disputation, was very much part of my Jewish education. Maybe it's part of my personality. I'm very happy to acknowledge the influence of Jewish culture on my own thinking and personality. But for me, it's a cultural endowment and gift. It's something that I have a great deal of affection for. I think in the way that, say, an Italian American would have great affection for everything Italian. It is certainly not theological, and nor is it. That is, I'm an atheist, so the advantage of being Jewish is that there's. It's kind of a don't ask, don't tell kind of religion, where as long as you do the right things, no one cares that much what you think. And of course, I don't do them either in terms of being religiously observant, but I do mind the cultural tradition for the humor, the language, the tradition of intellectual disputation. I also I used to think, and this was very much part of my background, that Judaism was the original source of morality in the Western tradition, that the Jews gave morality to the world in the form of the Torah and the Ten Commandments and so on. And I don't believe that anymore. I mean, I don't think there's anything, I don't think the Jews have been immoral, but I think that the source of morality goes back to the Greeks and was really developed in the Enlightenment, and that the Bible is a pretty rotten guide to how we should treat each other.
The idea that the pursuit of pleasure is almost inherently, in a sense, a futile struggle, because happiness is almost kind of designed to evaporate once you reach the various goals you're supposed to reach, because as organisms, we're not designed to ever be happy with what we are, really.
No, that's right. Also, in religions in which actually thinking something is sinful, I mean, this is, in one sense, this is completely unrealistic because we have 100 thoughts for every action.
Right.
On the other hand, there is some cognitive psychology behind that, namely, if you think about things, you're going to calculate ways of attaining it. That's what thinking is for.
Right.
And so thought control, for better or worse, will have some probabilistic influence on behavior.
Right. People aren't designed to fantasize just in order to keep fantasizing. They're designed to fantasize to make their fantasies real.
Yeah, because there's often very complicated ways of getting what you want, and if you think through all of the causal chains, you're more likely to know how to get what you want in the world. Perhaps the greatest discovery in human history, one that is logically prior to every other discovery, is that all of our traditional sources of belief are in fact generators of error and should be dismissed as sources of knowledge. These include faith, revelation, dogma, authority, charisma, augury, prophecy, intuition, clairvoyance, conventional wisdom, and that warm, invigorating glow of subjective certainty. How then can we know? Other than by proving mathematical and logical theorems, which are not about the material world, the answer is the process that Karl Popper called conjecture and refutation. We come up with ideas about the nature of reality, and this involves the combinatorial powers of human cognition that Tom mentioned in his kind introduction. And then we test those ideas against that reality, allowing the world to falsify the mistaken ones. The conjecture part of this formula, of course, presupposes the exercise of free speech. We offer conjectures without any prior assurance that they are correct. It's only by brooding ideas and seeing which ones withstand attempts to refute them that we acquire knowledge. Once this realization sank in during the scientific revolution, the Age of Reason, and the Enlightenment, the traditional understanding of the world was decimated. Everyone knows that the discovery that the Earth revolves around the sun rather than vice versa had to overcome fierce resistance from common sense and ecclesiastical authority. But the Copernican revolution was just the first event in a cataclysm that would make our current understanding of the world unrecognizable to our ancestors. We know that the belief systems of all the world's traditional religions and cultures, their theories of the origins of life, humans, and societies, are factually mistaken. We know, but our ancestors did not, that humans belong to a single species of African primate that developed agriculture, government, and writing late in its history. We know that our species is a tiny twig of a genealogical tree that embraces all living things and that emerged from prebiotic chemicals almost 4 billion years ago. We know that we live on a planet that revolves around one of 100 billion stars in our galaxy, which is one of 100 billion galaxies in a 13.8 billion year old universe, possibly one of a vast number of universes. We know that our intuitions about space, time, matter, and causation are incommensurable with the nature of reality on scales that are very large and very small. We know that the laws governing the physical world, including accidents, disease, and other misfortunes, have no goals that pertain to human well-being. That is, there is no such thing as fate, providence, karma, spells, curses, augury, divine retribution, or answered prayers, though the discrepancy between the laws of probability and the workings of cognition may explain why so many people believe there are. And we know that we did not always know these things, that the beloved convictions of every time and culture may be decisively falsified, doubtless including some we hold today. Even today, a majority of our compatriots don't believe in an idea that you and I would probably agree is one of the most important ideas in the history of human thought, namely Darwin's theory of natural selection. And one of the grounds for skepticism is the claim that you hear over and over again that no one has ever discovered a transitional fossil, which ironically is nowhere more false than in the case of Homo sapiens, where not only are there many transitional fossils, but before any of them had been found, Darwin correctly predicted that they would be found in Africa. Why? That's where the chimps live. And the chimps are morphologically the closest extant species to humans, displaying both the kind of confirmation of the more general idea of evolution, namely that there were gradual transitions, therefore you do predict, if you're lucky, to find a transitional form. But even more interestingly, the fact that Darwin's own theory did have, at the time, enormous predictive power, which is why he continues to be relevant. He didn't just put together the information around at the time, but in the best tradition of science made empirical predictions that could be falsified, the vast majority of which have not been falsified, such as where you'd find the first transitional fossils. The question of Darwinism as a term is interesting, both linguistically, in the sense that even though I think there's some unfortunate aspects to it, as a linguist, I know it's a losing battle to debate it, because once a name sticks, no amount of rational argument will lead to a replacement name, if that's what everyone knows the theory by. I mean, the reason that scientists are a bit skittish about the term Darwinism is that it goes against the grain of science, which is that it isn't the guy that matters, it's the idea. And another criticism of evolutionary theory by creationists is that the gods of Moses and Jesus have been replaced by the secularists with the gods of Darwin, Marx, and Freud. You often hear that. And so I think some scientists bridle at the idea that we have our God, who's a replacement, a secular saint, and that to identify an idea with a particular person misses the point that it's the idea that counts. Nonetheless, I agree with you that Darwin was and continues to be an extraordinary scientist, that both of us go back to his writings to get insights that continue to be relevant today, that he isn't just of historical interest. And this is certainly true in psychology, where there are a number of topics, for me, most notably in the expression of emotions in animals and man, where no one since Darwin has analyzed the phenomena in as much depth as he did. Maybe I'll give my favorite example, because this is, I think, after his prediction that the transitional human fossils would be found in Africa. This is my favorite bit of Darwiniana. And this is, in the expression of the emotions, he introduced a principle of what he called antithesis. That is, that when an animal displays a particular intention with a particular conformation of muscles and joint postures,
When it is in the opposite emotional state, it will display the opposite configuration or the opposite posture. And so he used this to explain why dogs wag their tails, that when a dog is ready to attack, it will lean forward, muscles rigid, tail pointed straight behind, in preparation to leap. What does a dog do when it's in a friendly frame of mind? It crouches down, has its head up, and its tail is limply wagging. Now, you ask, what's the equivalent in the human case? Well, when a human assumes an aggressive or angry posture, you have the shoulders squared, the brow lowered, the head facing forward, the arms pronated, and the fists clenched. Now, what happens when you have the joint for joint, muscle for muscle opposite of that? Well, you've got the head to the side, the brows raised, the shoulders hunched, the arms supinated, and the hands open. The evolution of the shrug. Now, no one since then has done better at explaining why we shrug. And again, it makes a prediction that the shrug should not just be a convention of our particular culture, but found in other cultures. And he was amazingly eclectic in terms of his empirical methods, but anytime a missionary or an explorer or a sailor was going to go overseas, he gave them a little questionnaire to fill out. Whenever you meet as he put it, a wild Malay or a Negro or a Hindu or an Eskimo, could you write down all of these features of what they do when they're happy, what they do when they're angry, and so on, and got back years later a set of diaries which allowed him to document the universality of many facial and bodily postures. An empirical body of research that basically lay ignored for another century until Paul Ekman revived the study of universals of expression. But anyway, that's just my favorite example of the continuing relevance of Darwin as a scientist.
More than 2 centuries after freedom of speech was enshrined in the First Amendment, that right is very much in the news. Campus speech codes, disinvited commencement speakers, jailed performance artists, exiled leakers, a blogger condemned to 1,000 lashes by one of our closest allies, and the massacre of a dozen French cartoonists have forced the democratic world to examine the roots of its commitment to free speech. Is free speech merely a symbolic talisman, like a national flag or motto? Is it just one of many values that we trade off against each other? Was Pope Francis right when he said that, quote, "you cannot make fun of the faith of others," unquote? May universities muzzle some students to protect the sensibilities of others? Did the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists, quote, "cross a line that separates free speech from toxic talk," as the dean of a school of journalism recently opined? Or is free speech fundamental, a right which, if not absolute, should be abrogated only in carefully circumscribed cases? The answer that I hope to persuade you of this evening is that free speech is indeed fundamental. It's important, I think, to remind ourselves why and to have the reasons at our fingertips when that right is called into question. The first reason is that the very thing we're doing when we ask whether free speech is fundamental, namely evaluating and exchanging ideas, presupposes that we have the right to evaluate and exchange ideas. In talking about free speech, or anything else, we're talking. We're not settling our disagreements by arm wrestling, or a beauty contest, or a pistol duel, unless you're willing to discredit yourself by declaring, in the sarcastic words of Nat Hentoff, "free speech for me, but not for thee," then as soon as you show up to a debate to argue against free speech, you've lost it. But in a process that's been called the humanitarian revolution, these brutal, sadistic forms of corporal punishment were abolished. They were abolished within a fairly narrow window centered in the second half of the 18th century. Here we have a timeline from 1650 to 1850 showing a number of major states of the era that abolished cruel physical punishments, including the United States with its famous prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment in the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution. Also abolished during this period was the profligate application of the death penalty for non-lethal crimes. 18th century England had 222 capital offenses on the books, including poaching, counterfeiting, robbing a rabbit warren, being in the company of gypsies, and strong evidence of malice in a child 7 to 14 years of age. The death penalty was not just in the law books, but was exuberantly applied. Samuel Johnson writes of a 7-year-old girl who was hanged for stealing a petticoat. By 1861, the number of capital crimes had been reduced to 4. Likewise, in the United States in the 17th and 18th centuries, the death penalty was prescribed and used for theft, sodomy, bestiality, adultery, witchcraft, concealing birth, slave revolt, and counterfeiting. Here we have a graph that extends from 1650 to the year 2000, showing the percentage of American executions for crimes other than murder. In the colonial and early federal period, a majority of the executions were for non-lethal crimes. In recent years, the only crime other than murder that has been punished by death is conspiracy to commit murder. The death penalty itself, of course, has been abolished throughout the Western world, except in the United States. This timeline shows that just about every European country has abolished capital punishment. Most of the abolitions have taken place in the last 60 years or so. But well before that, European countries lost their taste for executing people. The blue line shows the number of European countries that actually execute people, whether or not they have capital punishment on the books. And you can see that there's been a steady erosion of the application of the death penalty before it was stricken from the law books. Now, the United States is famously an outlier, or I should say that 34 of the 50 states are outliers because 16 have abolished it, a number that has increased by 5 in just the last decade. But even in the United States, the death penalty is a shadow of its former self. Here we have a graph from 1625 to 2000 showing the number of American executions per capita. The graph shows that the execution rate has plunged. Today, for all its notoriety, the death penalty is applied approximately 45 times a year in a country that has almost 17,000 homicides. Also abolished during the Humanitarian Revolution were witch hunts, religious persecution, such as burning heretics at the stake, dueling, blood sports, debtors' prisons, and perhaps most famously, slavery. Slavery used to be legal everywhere on earth, as you can see in the number of states that abolished slavery in 1600. But in a process that began in the second half of the 18th century, it was targeted for elimination in country after country, a process that reached its completion in 1980 when the last spot on Earth, Mauritania, finally abolished slavery. And so for the first time in history, slavery is now illegal everywhere on Earth. There is a lot to say about political language. One of them is that the logic of plausible deniability and mutual knowledge and relationship negotiation that drives us to indirect speech in ordinary conversation, like passing the salt, is even more magnified in the political arena, because anything concrete that a politician says in terms of policy is bound to offend some sector of the population. So the art of a lot of political rhetoric is to say things that are vague enough that there is plausible deniability in terms of some position that will tick off a constituency, but that can be interpreted by those who are receptive in a way that's favorable to their interests. And this process pushes politicians to vaguer and windier and emptier rhetoric, like, say, what is your platform for running the country? Change. Well, yes, but what kind of change? Well, if it's vague enough that everyone can read into it the kind of change they favor without there being any change in the things that are aspects of the status quo that they're happy with. Now, that's, of course, extremely hypocritical, but on the other hand, it's we, the audience, who are equally hypocritical, because what happens when a politician actually comes out and says something contentful or substantive? There's a firestorm.
the politician will have committed what we all know as a gaffe. Now, of course, the best definition of a gaffe is from Michael Kinsley, namely a gaffe is when a politician says something that's true. And I think the broadcast media and many of the print media are guilty of making this worse, because their idea of political coverage, when it's not the horse race, is just gaffe spotting. The presidential debates, I think quite egregiously, are covered by the media simply in terms of waiting for one or the other to commit a gaffe, and which then gets endlessly discussed. To the extent that we allow ourselves to be swayed by so-called gaffes, by the one soundbite, when people lose their jobs, they turn to guns and religion. We're a nation of whiners, and they get the lipstick on a pig, and so on. We're, like it or not, forcing the politicians to give us empty rhetoric. So that's one dimension. Another one, of course, is competitive framing. Whether a tax increase is paying our bills and not beggaring our grandchildren, or whether it is funneling more money to pork barrel projects and taking the dollars that